My hands shook as I held the film reel. This is the source of it all, I thought. The reason Lacey went missing, the reason any of this shit had happened at all. As determined as I was to see this operation through, a lingering feeling of fear and hesitance never left my side. What's the film like, exactly? I asked, my voice shaking just a tad. Colin shook his head. I don't know. Not like I ever watched it. Can't really prepare you for much there. Sorry. That was more or less the response I was expecting. Colin sighed, starting to look anxious. We don't have time, though. He could come back at any moment. He looked at Jimmy. You still got ammo? Jimmy tapped at his belt proudly. Silly question. No monster's gonna get the jump on me. The haphazard plan that we formed went as follows. We'd rush over to the theater where everything had started, since that was the only place we'd actually be able to play the film. Since it was still likely being monitored by the police, we'd have to rely on Sven's FBI badge to dissolve that suspicion. According to Colin, if Mr. Blank's projection hadn't come back to attack us before we managed to enter the theater, it sure as hell was going to be there once we did. And of course, it was going to be aggressive. That's when Jimmy comes in. He's going to keep distracting it while Colin sets up the film. Once he did, Sven and I would be the ones to watch it. He wanted to save his wife. I wanted to save Lacey. None of us were backing down. Colin also gave us some very much needed details regarding the film itself, even though a lot of it was just speculation on his part. Supposedly, the film does something strange to the viewer's state of mind. The film exists in one plane of existence, Mr. Blank's. We exist in our own. So how does anybody traverse this gap and move from one to the other? Well, we could only really theorize there. Colin claimed it was about emotions. The range of human emotions are spectrum, obviously, but not a two-dimensional one. With happiness and sadness, distress and calm, pain and pleasure at their respective extremes, nearly every feeling spurred on by activities in our daily lives are different. Some are more similar to each other than others, but no two distinct feelings are truly identical. Even the same emotions that you perceive experiencing thousands of times over the course of your life is actually an entirely new experience each and every time. Now, I'm getting off track here, but look, emotions are complicated, and according to Colin's theory, they also act as a catalyst that could move conscious thoughts between different realities. If some kind of impulse evoked a strong and specific enough emotion, that could act as said catalyst. But if it were only their thoughts that had moved, then what the hell had happened to their bodies? That mystery remained. However, Colin was quite certain that the people who'd been transported were all still alive. Can't feed off a dead person's emotions, after all. There's something else you'd probably like to know, Colin said. Something really interesting. My ears perked up. I did know a few people that crossed over into Mr. Blank's realm, managed to make it back out. They all told me that they felt themselves crossing over to a certain threshold of fear before they left our own world. However, they were still somewhat cognizant of what had happened. They knew that they were still in the theater. This wasn't the world that they belonged to. They weren't petrified to the point where they lost all sense of their past reality. Because of this, they always kept themselves grounded, convincing themselves that none of it was real despite what Mr. Blank threw at them. Eventually, they got back using the sheer will out of their mind alone. I breathed a sigh of relief. At the moment, there was nothing that I needed to hear more. But you should also know that they all committed suicide within the next 3 months. Yeah, you could have left that part out, I said. It's not going to be easy. But now that you know this going in, you'll have an advantage. Try and be ready for anything, because nothing's off the table here. With our asses on the clock, we began making our way to the theater. When we arrived, there was a single bored-looking cop sitting in his vehicle near the entrance. He didn't ask questions when Sven flashed his badge. In fact, he looked pretty eager to leave. We didn't waste any time once we got in. Colin began setting up the film while I waited anxiously in the theater. We offered to help with the process, but he told us that we'd just slow him down. I wasn't going to argue with him there. I sat down on one of the seats, burying my hands into my face. I was nervous. There's no second guessing that fact. Can I even do this? I thought to myself. Fuck. I have to do this. I felt somebody put a hand on my lap. At first I thought it was Fen trying to convince me, but then I realized that didn't seem like something he would do. I'll be, Jimmy spoke up. Varmin's back. Against my better judgment, I snapped my head to the side, staring at what appeared to be a mask composed of a variety of segmented human faces. Don't move, kid! Jimmy's voice boomed from across the theater. Before I knew it, the ghoulish face was blown to the side, blood exploding from the other side of its temple. My ears were ringing from the shot as I looked towards Jimmy, who was holding some kind of oversized pistol. You're welcome, he smiled. Jeez, I muttered, still trying to regain my bearings. A few seconds later, I heard Sven cursing. I looked over, watching as a feral beast-looking creature grabbed him by the neck. Once again, Jimmy blasted it away. My brain rang some more. It looked like Mr. Blank had regained his stamina, and I sure as hell wasn't excited about that. Goddamn motherfucker! This time, Jimmy was the one cursing. Mr. Blank, now in the form of an oversized zombie wearing brass knuckles, it had gotten the jump on him, forcing him to resort to a fist fight. But he was holding up surprisingly well, dodging, parrying, countering each of the zombie's strikes. Jimmy ended up pummeling it within a minute. How the hell? Where did you... I began asking, dumbfounded at his apparently vast array of combat skills. I fought in the evisceration matches on a planet you wouldn't dare step foot on, partner. I know my shit, he grinned. As if I was supposed to understand remotely what the hell he was talking about. I didn't have time to ask, though. I could hear something breathing down my neck once again. Come on, Colin, I thought to myself. Hurry the fuck up. And then it happened. The projector suddenly flicked on, and the breathing stopped. I scanned the theater, but Mr. Blank was nowhere to be seen. I locked eyes with Sven for a moment. This was it. This was the culmination of everything we'd been through. Well, Jimmy spoke up. Looks like this is it. I bid good luck to you both. The lights began to dim. I laughed to myself. Was that really necessary? The reaction was more of a coping mechanism than anything else. I was utterly frozen in terror. Sven and I were silent as we took our seats. For the first few seconds, I closed my eyes, afraid to open them even a little bit. But I knew that eventually I had to. So I did. And I cannot begin to describe what I saw in front of me. Before I divulge into what I saw in that theater, let's do a quick mental exercise. Hell. What does that word mean to you? More specifically, what do you visualize when you hear it? Put yourself in that environment right now. Are you walking through scorching flames while demons scream at you? A dark forest with thousands of beady eyes following your every move? Trapped underneath ice with something gnawing at your feet? Each one of us has an idea of what our own personal hell would look like. I found out what mine looked like in the theater. The film opened on a shot of a plain, abandoned city washed in dark blue. It was hard to tell what time of day it was. But the whole place just looked depressing. After a few seconds, a figure came stumbling into the frame. A man wearing plain clothes with distorted facial features. His movements were desperate, stumbling through the empty streets in an ostensible attempt to evade something. I found out what he was running from only a few seconds later. It was another man, naked this time, with black, oozing sores covering his entire body. There's also a bloody, dirty bag tied around his head. His limbs twitched and contorted as he ran after the faceless man, letting out an unearthly, croaking scream as he moved. The faceless man was screaming as well. Though his voice sounded all too human, he sounded terrified. I'm not sure how long I was watching for, but it felt like hours. At a point, I even gave up on the objective at hand. I wanted to turn away from the screen so badly, however, I couldn't. My eyes stayed glued on the horrific scene in front of me. I couldn't move. I started wondering how Sven was holding up, watching something like this. It was only until later I realized we weren't even watching the same thing at all. Personal hells. Everybody's different. At a point, I started feeling strange, as if I couldn't distinguish real life from what was happening on the screen. My attention was fixated on the faceless man, almost like I was seeing things through his perspective. Shit, I thought before my mind drifted too far off to the deep end. I realized something extremely important at the very last moment. It's just a movie. A really disturbing fucking movie. The revelation came at the optimal time. I was already being sucked into Mr. Blank's realm. I could feel it. My physical self dissolving into an obscure void, yet I was cognizant of this fact. And while I was certainly scared, I was also determined. My vision went black for an unknown duration. When I opened them back up, my world was washed in a dark blue. I could feel goosebumps popping up on my skin. I was freezing, despite wearing a hoodie and jeans. There was also something behind me. I turned around, seeing the man with the bag over his head staggering towards me. It didn't take a genius to discern what had happened. I was now in the movie, not knowing exactly what to do, and fueled by sheer impulse, I began running through the empty streets. After the initial shock, I tried remembering what Colin had told me. I had to remember that none of this was real, despite how real it felt. But at the same time, how the hell was this not real? The cold wind bit at my face. My joints ached against the concrete below. I was even beginning to run out of breath. It felt real as hell. My mind started becoming frenetic. How the hell was this possible? Where the hell was I? We never felt physical sensations in our dreams, so what was this? I turned around again, noticing the bag-headed man was getting closer, his inhuman shrieks sending shivers down my spine. I was starting to lose it. Starting to lose my own sense of reality. The streets ahead of me were endless and unchanging, nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I could hear myself beginning to whimper, utter terror overwhelming my senses, forcing me to abandon any previous thoughts, any connections that I had to the world that I belonged in. Was this the world I belonged in? How long had I been in here? Maybe this was all I knew. It was an unnerving sensation, and one that caused my eyes to begin watering. I was in hell. This was my existence. Cold tears began streaming down my face. As I continued to run from this monstrosity behind me, I was beginning to forget where I'd even come from, and I was getting tired. I closed my eyes, preparing to give up entirely. Doing so hurt as tears began freezing up. But wait. That didn't make any sense. I remember reading about this once, about how tears would only freeze at below 40, and it sure as hell wasn't that cold. It was an utterly random fact, and one that I had no reason keeping stored in my brain, but remembering it in that moment helped me more than I could ever know. If that part didn't make any sense, then what else was off about the situation? What was I doing here? I opened my eyes again, staring up at the sky. It was empty. No sun. No stars. No moon, no clouds? That wasn't right either. The buildings that surrounded me, I'd never seen a place like this before. I didn't belong here. This wasn't my world. This was Mr. Blank's world. Why had I come here? To save Lacey. None of this was real. I stopped in my tracks, catching my breath. I turned around, watching as the man behind me got slower and slower before stopping only a few feet away from me. He looked confused, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't running. Why had I stopped? Because none of this was real. Why would I fear something that wasn't real? Hey, fuckface, I spoke up. Where the hell is Lacey? The man took a step back. Don't you fucking run, I said. Where the fuck is she? He started backing up faster. My grin grew wider. I'm gonna tear you apart with my bare fucking hands if you don't tell me. Suddenly, I wasn't so cold anymore. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Where the fuck is she? My voice was growing primal. My impulse was fueled by a culmination of all the fear and frustration that I'd been feeling up until this point. I caught up to the bagged man relatively quickly, tackling him and then wrestling him down to the ground. I could feel his sores oozing all over me, which was quite the disgusting sensation, but forced myself to ignore it. Where is she? I screamed as I began strangling him. However, instead of gasping for air, the man simply began laughing. And of course he would. This was all a farce. What the hell? I screamed, grabbing the bag and ripping it from his face. What I found was a blank face staring back at me. You think I'm scared of you? A booming voice resonated throughout the space, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, and suddenly the man began dissolving. Well, dissolving wasn't the right word. He was morphing into thousands and thousands of insects. Horrified, I jumped back. I watched as the insects began crawling on top of each other, forming what appeared to be a humanoid torso on top of spider-like legs, and of course, there was a giant blank face at the very top of the abomination. Run, boy. The voice boomed again. Apparently, things weren't going to be so easy. How the hell was I supposed to win? I could feel the fear rushing back into my system. Mr. Blank had just been fucking with me the entire time. With no other options in sight, I did what he said, and I began running from the insect monstrosity. I looked over my shoulder every now and then, watching as the grotesque entity crawled towards me, knocking down buildings as it did so. But surely this thing was faster than me, I thought. Wait, of course it was. He never wanted to catch me, he just wanted me to keep running. Every trick he threw at me was an attempt to push me into a corner of fear I wouldn't be able to get away from. Fuck that. Fuck that, I was gonna hit back. As scared as I might have been, I was gonna have to force myself not to be. I skidded to a stop. I spotted a piece of wood off on the street and I picked it up before turning around and chucking it at the creature. I missed. But the message was sent. The insect creature, Mr. Blank himself, stopped in its tracks as well, seemingly confused as to what to do next. I wasn't scared, and Mr. Blank couldn't understand why. I mean, what is fear, anyway? There's a dictionary definition, of course, but what evokes fear in one person and won't necessarily evoke it out of the next? At this point, Mr. Blank was trying too hard. He transformed again into an even bigger monster, resembling an amalgamation of black sludge, rotting corpses, writhing tendrils. Was it scary? I mean, maybe to a 14-year-old. After everything I'd seen, this only made me laugh. Laughing. Joy, mockery, every emotion that contrasted fear and despair, and that was the ultimate weapon against him. Suddenly, I remembered the plan. I reached into my pocket and I pulled out my phone and I got the camera ready, but unfortunately, Mr. Blank disappeared before I could start recording. Nevertheless, the tables had turned. Who was scared now? I wasn't exactly sure where to go, so I just picked a random direction and I began running. But something unexpected happened. The environment around me began to change. No more buildings, no longer washed in dark blue. I suddenly found myself standing in an endless field of yellow flowers, with a cloudless sky above. For a moment, I was absolutely jarred. What the hell had happened, I thought. Where'd I ended up? That answer soon became apparent when I looked down at the flowers. They weren't right, to say the least. They were blinking back at me. Some had mouths lined with razor-like teeth, vigorously chomping away at the air. Some had their petals replaced with writhing fingers ending in claws. This was somebody else's hell. A rather interesting one, at that. Guess I'd better start running again, I thought. Trying to be as careful as I could, I began stepping over the ghastly flowers. After a few minutes, the environment changed again. This time, it was night, and I was standing in front of a precarious-looking rope bridge hanging over a deep cavern. I was beginning to understand what was going on. I suppose that I had broken the system. In a sense, my own hell was no longer scary to me, so I was free to roam through somebody else's. Everybody who had been trapped by Mr. Blank. Light bulbs began to go off in my head. I remembered a conversation I had had with Lacey right after we'd gone through a haunted house on Halloween. It was a conversation about fear. What we were most afraid of. What I'm most afraid of, I remember her telling me. Okay, this is a weird one, but mazes. Yeah, I mean, like, imagine randomly being trapped in a maze and never being able to find your way out. Mazes. I knew what I had to look for now. I couldn't tell you how many different hells I ended up traversing. Probably upwards of 30, maybe close to 40. They were all unique, all utterly horrifying in their own sense. But what was even more interesting were the people I met along the way. Out of all the hells I found myself in, I came across 14 people who were trapped in them. 9 were already catatonic. 2 were hysterical and impossible to reason with. As for the other 3, well, I don't want to give myself too much credit here, but I think I saved them. Not that it was easy. They weren't so willing to let things go. They truly thought that they were in hell, destined to live that way forever. They'd long forgotten about their past lives, who they were before, the time they'd spent in the theater before being transported to Mr. Blank's world. Trying to convince them otherwise was nothing short of a task, especially given the environment around us. But I wasn't scared. I had to prove it to them. Nothing was going to kill us. Nothing was going to hurt us if we didn't let it. By the time I'd found Lacey's hell, I had a grateful group of 3 by my side. Dash, a 21-year-old college kid, Nicole, 25-year-old computer programmer, and Roman, a 27-year-old soldier. We sure as hell had been through a lot together at that point. It started feeling like days had passed since I was in the theater, but my resolve never slipped. I was finding her no matter what. I nearly dropped to my knees in relief when I found myself standing inside the labyrinth. It had all paid off in the end. The walls were about 15 feet high, covered in cracks and coated in moss. The ground was also comprised of cracked stone. There were torches set up every few feet or so, illuminating the place, but just barely. So I guess splitting up's probably not the best idea, Dash said. I wouldn't be scared if we did, though, Roman said, grinning at me. I'm not scared of a fake place like this. I smiled back. When I met him, he'd been petrified, as if he'd given up any kind of hope. But here he was now, ready to help me take down Mr. Blank and find Lacey. You're right, I responded. Nothing scary about this place. But Dash is also right. Better stick together. Everybody nodded and we began searching. About every 10 turns we'd come across some kind of creature wandering through. They ranged from eyeless little girls to ghoul-looking things. But that wasn't a problem. We'd seen more frightening things than that. Once it was obvious that we weren't taking that fear bait, the creatures pretty much ignored us. I couldn't keep track of how many turns we took. Over 100 at least. It's pretty obvious why Lacey wasn't exactly a fan of these, but eventually we came across something different. A set of stairs leading down into darkness. Unlike the creatures that posed a more uncertain threat, it evoked a fear of the unknown, making it exponentially more frightening than any of the corny monsters we'd encountered before. I could see the hesitation rising amongst our group, but that was to be expected. That's exactly what Mr. Blank wanted. For that reason, I didn't even think about it before descending the stairs, using my phone's flashlight to guide me along. It didn't matter if nobody followed. All that mattered was that I didn't let the fear stop me. To my surprise, I heard 3 sets of footsteps following behind me. I smiled to myself. That was it. The final stretch of all the madness I'd experienced so far. I'm not sure how far we'd walked. Not that it mattered. I'm sure everything in this world was nothing more than an illusion, even time. I had to tell myself that, in order to deal with what we came across next. The stairs ended, leading to what appeared to be a bottomless void. Sounds emanated from below. They were obscure ones, things that I'd never heard before, leading to chills involuntarily crawling down my spine. Mr. Blank had certainly stepped his game up. No cheap scares here. What was presented in front of me petrified me to the bone. Once again, I could see hesitation amongst our group. What do you think's down there? Nicole asked. I paused for a moment, considering the question. Nothing. Nothing at all. I didn't let another thought cross my mind before jumping down. For the longest time, it felt like I was floating. If you ask me how long exactly, there's no way I could have told you. There was nothing around me, no sensation at all. I was in the void, and soon enough, I felt solid ground beneath my feet. I picked the direction I was already facing and began walking. Again, I had no sense of time. My mind began drifting with each step I took, but I never let it get away from me completely. An indiscernible amount of time later, I found myself standing in front of a stone clearing with everybody else behind me. We were at the edge of the maze. I'd found what I was looking for. I let out a deep exhale, probably the deepest one of my life. Lacey. She was right in front of me, curled into a ball with her back against the stone wall. She was wearing what she typically did. Blue jeans and a green flannel shirt. Upon hearing my voice, she looked up at me, her eyes long red from what had been a constant stream of tears. She didn't look happy to see me, but I didn't expect her to be. She'd probably been given too much false hope in a place like this. "You're not real," she whimpered, before beginning to cry again. "Leave me alone." I approached her slowly. "Lace." She looked back up. I was one of the few people who called her that. "I'm one of the only real things in this entire place." I grabbed her hand. She pulled back a bit at first, but I didn't let go. I didn't force it either. "You shouldn't be here. Let's get back to where we belong." Her skin was warm. So was mine. I saw a spark of understanding in her eyes, but before I could smile, a familiar presence made an appearance. A large shadow cast itself into the light of the torches. I looked up, seeing a tall, skeletal figure with a blank face leering down at us. Lacey flinched, but I just gripped her hand tighter. I looked up at Mr. Blank and shot him a self-satisfying grin. "There's nothing left for you to do here." A moment of silence followed as he continued leering. "Do you consider this a victory?" he asked. "No," I began to respond. "Not really. But you didn't win either." The whole time my hand had been slowly reaching into my pocket for my phone. I grabbed it and I opened the video camera, but it was too late. He disappeared in the blink of an eye. I grinned to myself. He's scared. I frightened the boogeyman. I looked back at Lacey, who looked equally confused and terrified, but a sense of reality had returned to her face. Before, it seemed as if she was in a trance, in the process of forgetting where she'd come from. "Seth. Wait." She shook her head. "How are you?" "Looks like she's back," Nicole said from behind me. "You're pretty good at this, aren't you?" "I suppose I was." "And who are—" Lacey began before trailing off. "There's a lot I have to explain, but not here." "Right," Roman said. "How are we getting back?" I'm not sure how the answer to that question came to me. It was kind of just something I figured out along the way. "What do you mean?" I responded. "We've been back the whole time. We never went anywhere. Don't you remember?" It took a second, but Roman began to smile. "We never left the theater, did we?" I nodded. The other two soon followed suit. "This is some Dorothy type shit, isn't it?" Dash said, grinning as well. "No fucking place like home." I looked back at Lacey. "We were never here. Don't you remember?" It took a moment, but she nodded. "Yeah," she said, her lips curling into a slight grin. "I think I'm starting to." Pretty soon after, I remember my vision going black. Well, I'd be lying if I said that I remember what happened at all. I just remember waking up back in the theater with the same time that I'd spent in Mr. Blank's world still fresh in my mind. It didn't feel like a dream, and it wasn't one. I sat up rapidly, feeling a hand on my shoulder as I did so. I turned around, seeing Sven smiling at me. "Finally back. Took you a while," he said. "Sven, did you?" He nodded. "I found her. She's back." I looked around the room, but the only people there were Colin, Jimmy, and a few bewildered-looking police officers. "Then where is she?" I looked around some more. "Wait, where's Lacey?" My heart stopped for a moment. If you will," one of the cops spoke up, "we might be able to shed some light on that." Apparently, the police had found the people who had gone missing in the theater in an abandoned warehouse 3 towns over. When they were first discovered, they were still unconscious, albeit alive. However, while they were being transported to the nearest hospital, 2 of them woke up. 2 university students, a male and a female, whose names hadn't been released. Apparently, a dazed woman had also been found wandering through the woods in a different state as well. I had a good feeling on who they could be. So did Sven. And I was right. I hauled ass to the hospital immediately. The cops tried to stop me, but Sven flashed his badge again and got them off my case. He really was a good asset to have around. I looked through the windows of the rooms the discovered students were staying in. I don't think my smile has ever been wider when I saw Lacey sitting up in her bed, alive and playing with her hands as she usually did. She looked a bit frail, but there was no doubt about it, she was smiling. She remembered everything. I left without saying anything to her. All that I needed to know was that she was alive. Our reunion would come later. For now, she needed to rest. On the way back, I learned how she ended up in the warehouse so far away to begin with. Apparently, Mr. Blank's influence was severe and far-reaching. He had a whole legion of fear-induced slaves doing his bidding in our world. Since he needed his victims to remain alive and undisturbed, he'd order people who'd been petrified into obeying him in the past, like Colin, to storm the theaters, quickly drag the bodies out, and then drive them off to a far remote location. Once there, they'd keep the physical bodies alive while their frightened minds remained trapped in Mr. Blank's world. This time, they even took it up a notch. They replaced the video surveillance with loop footage taken when the theater was empty, in order to confuse the investigators even more. It sure as hell worked. A foolproof system, right? Well, not really. 7 arrests were made that day. It'll be an interesting trial for sure. Nevertheless, I can't say that I hate these people. I can't hate Colin either. There's only one person I can direct my anger towards. And he's still alive out there. And I feel a lingering responsibility to rectify that. We'll see where this goes. I got a call from Jimmy a few hours ago. I told him about what I saw in the other dimension, about how I wanted to get rid of Mr. Blank once and for all. Got something you might be interested in, he told me. You see, this varmint apparently got a bounty on his head out there in the Cosmo. We can make a real killing if we reel him in. Got another buddy who's interested as well, name's Dex. But he's got a weird arm, so don't freak out when you meet him. Freaky weird arm. Alright. Talk to you about the details later. Bye for now. Looks like the hunt might be back on. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and it's the end of today's video, or today's episode of the podcast, which means I want to tell you guys thank you so much for watching. And thank you for hitting like and subscribe and bell, and I think it's still subscribe on podcasts. One day I'll look that up. If you guys are listening on your phone, like I think the statistics say like 90% of you are, then on your phone you can also listen on another place. It's an app called Chilling. The Chilling app allows you to listen to stories from me that you can't get here, as well as stories from a whole group of other narrators. A lot of them you've heard before, some of them you've even heard here, like Autumn Ivy. Plus, it allows you to control the background music and background ambiance, which I think is probably one of the coolest features on there. Check out Chilling on Android and iOS now. I want to give a very big thank you to everybody on Patreon, especially Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Brian Arce, Bobby Karman, Tristain Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Crazy Kid, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Ika Limchok, Dirt Diver 030, Robert Schonkwiller, USMC, Matt Bach, Jables Raz, Masked Note, Joshua Mullen, Dan Pham, Matthew McNeese, Ben Spates, Jeremy H., Raltizal, Fikamal, Nana, The Morgan, Nick Weaver, MeltedLake, Tali Sue, Sky Mara Ravenswood, William King, Reaper 61167, Darth Miver, Micah Ortiz, Satanic Aries, aisodoehtraed, Nessie, Ronnie Hansen, Parafa Panda, Bardohawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Billy Morrow, Sashi Suzaku, at Grizzly Olsen Pro, My Body Sounds Like Rice Krispies, Jay, Miss Exandra, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Azarine Fox, Fried Chicken 12, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Willis, Infernal One, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trey Smiles, and Corey Kenshin. Like I said, I cannot thank you guys enough. for being a part of this, and that goes to everybody down there in the description, and everybody who even can just support for $1. Thank you guys, thank you guys, thank you guys. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season, and sweet dreams.